Tannenberg Valley, January 12, 1945, 09:23 hours. Oberst Ingrid Steinberg of the German 247th Infantry Division, crouched in her reinforced observation bunker, field glasses trained on the American forward positions across the snow-covered meadows. Confident that her expertly constructed defensive network could withstand whatever crude bombardment the Americans might attempt, completely unaware that in precisely 8 seconds, every tactical principle she had mastered during 4 years of warfare would be annihilated along with 3/4 of her command. The bitter January wind howled through the pine forests surrounding Tannenberg Valley as Oberst Steinberg reviewed her defensive preparations one final time. At 34, she was among the youngest regimental commanders in the Wehrmacht, having earned her position through exceptional performance during the retreat from Normandy and the subsequent defense of the West Wall. Her tactical acumen had been honed at the Kriegsakademie in Munich, where she had graduated summa cum laude in artillery coordination and defensive operations. Frau Oberst, called Major Greta Hoffmann, her chief of staff, approaching through the communication trench with morning intelligence reports clutched in her frost-numbed hands. American reconnaissance has intensified near Sector Bravo. Signal intercepts suggest they're preparing for another of their wasteful bombardments. Steinberg nodded with the calm assurance of an officer who had survived the cauldron of the Eastern Front before being transferred west. She had witnessed American artillery tactics firsthand during the battles around Aachen and Metz, and the pattern was always identical: excessive, undisciplined, and fundamentally predictable. American gunners fired enormous quantities of ammunition with little regard for tactical precision, relying on sheer volume rather than the surgical accuracy that characterized German artillery doctrine. The 247th Infantry Division's defensive positions in Tannenberg Valley represented the culmination of German engineering expertise and tactical innovation. Over 3 months, Steinberg's combat engineers had constructed an intricate network of interconnected bunkers, each designed to survive direct hits from the largest American shells. The main defensive line followed the natural contours of the valley, with overlapping fields of fire that created multiple kill zones for advancing infantry. Behind this, a secondary defensive line provided depth, while carefully concealed artillery positions offered immediate fire support. Their forward observers established positions on Maple Hill yesterday, reported Hauptmann Lisa Weber, commander of the division's artillery regiment. Weber, a veteran of campaigns in Norway and the Low Countries, had earned the Knight's Cross for her innovative counter-battery techniques. They'll spend 40 minutes registering their guns, then commence a rolling barrage from east to west across our positions. This assessment reflected everything German artillery officers had learned about American tactics through 2 years of combat on the Western Front. American fire missions followed a rigid template. Forward observers would call in registration rounds to establish accurate firing data. Meteorologists would calculate atmospheric conditions, and gun crews would methodically adjust their pieces for maximum precision. Only then would the actual bombardment begin, typically lasting between 90 minutes and 3 hours, with shells arriving in carefully timed sequences that allowed defenders to predict the pattern and take appropriate cover. Steinberg had exploited this predictability countless times. When American observers began their registration fires, German troops would execute practiced displacement drills, moving to alternate positions while the Americans wasted precious ammunition on empty bunkers. Once the rolling barrage commenced, experienced Wehrmacht soldiers could read the timing, identifying safe intervals to move between positions or even launch counterattacks against American artillery positions that had revealed their locations through sustained firing. The 247th Infantry Division's confidence in facing American artillery stemmed from a military tradition dating back to Frederick the Great, refined through the Franco-Prussian War and perfected during the Great War. German artillery doctrine emphasized mathematical precision, tactical flexibility, and the seamless integration of firepower with combined arms operations. Officers like Steinberg had studied the campaigns of General Erich von Falkenhayn and Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, learning how properly employed artillery could break enemy offensives while conserving ammunition and preserving tactical mobility. Major Hoffmann spread a detailed map across the bunker's planning table, pointing to the carefully plotted fields of fire that protected each approach to the German positions. Our 10.5-centimeter batteries are registered on all likely assembly areas. The moment American infantry begins their advance, we can deliver precise interdiction fires that will shatter their attack before it reaches our main line.
British Hauptmann Weber's artillery regiment exemplified this tradition. Her gunners had trained extensively in rapid displacement techniques, moving their pieces immediately after firing to avoid counter-battery fire. Her forward observers maintained detailed range cards for every prominent terrain feature within their sectors, allowing them to engage targets of opportunity without time-consuming calculations. Most importantly, her fire direction center could coordinate fires from multiple batteries to create devastating concentrations on high-priority targets, a capability that had proven decisive in numerous defensive engagements. The Americans relied too heavily on their material superiority, Weber observed, adjusting her field glasses to observe the distant American positions. They fired 10 rounds where we would fire 1, but they lacked the tactical sophistication to employ their firepower with precision. When their predictable barrage begins, we'll execute displacement plan Gustav, weather their bombardment from alternate positions, then strike back with calculated counter-battery fires that will silence their guns and disrupt their attack. This confidence was shared throughout the German chain of command. General der Artillerie Margarete von Seydlitz, commanding the 14th Corps Artillery, had personally inspected Steinberg's positions and pronounced them impregnable to anything short of sustained bombardment by the entire American artillery park. Von Seydlitz, a veteran of artillery actions from Verdun to Stalingrad, represented the institutional wisdom of the German officer corps, and her endorsement carried enormous weight among subordinate commanders. Intelligence reports compiled by the 247th Division staff painted a consistent picture of American artillery capabilities and limitations. Unlike German gunners, who received extensive individual training and prided themselves on technical expertise, American artillery relied on mass production techniques applied to warfare. American batteries fired predetermined concentrations based on standard firing tables, with little adaptation for local conditions or tactical requirements. Their forward observers are adequate but unimaginative, reported Oberleutnant Arne Richter, the division's intelligence officer. Richter had interrogated dozens of captured American artillery personnel, building a comprehensive assessment of enemy capabilities. They used standardized procedures for every fire mission, following doctrinal templates rather than adapting to battlefield conditions. Their radio communications are extensive but predictable, using code words that our signal intelligence units have largely deciphered. According to German intelligence estimates, American artillery strength lay in quantity rather than quality. The Americans possessed enormous numbers of guns, unlimited ammunition supplies, and sophisticated logistics networks that could sustain prolonged bombardments. However, they lacked the tactical flexibility that characterized German operations. American fire plans were typically prepared hours or days in advance, with little capability for rapid adjustment based on changing battlefield conditions. Most significantly, American artillery doctrine emphasized area bombardment rather than precision engagement. Where German batteries would engage specific targets with calculated numbers of rounds, American units would saturate entire grid squares with overwhelming volumes of fire. This approach was effective against large formations in open terrain, but wasteful and tactically rigid when facing dispersed defensive positions constructed by experienced German engineers. They treat artillery like a factory production line, observed Major Hoffmann, reviewing the latest intelligence summaries. Maximum output, minimum efficiency, no consideration for tactical subtlety. It's the American industrial approach applied to warfare, crude but powerful within its limitations. This assessment shaped German defensive planning throughout the Western Front. Wehrmacht commanders anticipated American artillery preparations lasting several hours, providing ample warning for defensive countermeasures. German positions were constructed to survive direct hits from 155mm shells, the heaviest weapons in the American inventory, with alternate positions allowing rapid displacement during bombardments. Most importantly, German artillery was positioned to exploit American predictability, with counter-battery fires planned against known American assembly areas and firing positions. The dawn of January 12, 1945 began like countless other mornings along the Western Front. Oberst Steinberg conducted her routine inspection of the forward positions, moving through the communication trenches that connected her observation bunker to the front-line fighting positions. The ground was frozen solid, making movement difficult, but providing excellent overhead protection for the buried bunkers and gun emplantments that comprised her defensive network. Private Ursula Braun, manning the forward observation post on Hill 293, reported normal American activity through her periscope. "Typical morning routine, Frau Oberst," she called through the field telephone. "Vehicle movement behind their lines, occasional patrol activity, nothing unusual. No sign of artillery preparation." This observation was consistent with German intelligence expectations. American artillery typically required extensive preparation time before major bombardments, with survey teams establishing precise gun positions, meteorological sections calculating atmospheric conditions, and forward observers registering fires on prominent terrain features. The absence of registration rounds indicated that any American attack was still hours away, providing German forces with adequate time for final defensive preparations.
British. Steinberg paused at Battery Position Alpha, where Hauptmann Weber's 105mm howitzers were concealed beneath carefully constructed camouflage nets. The gun crews were conducting routine maintenance on their pieces, cleaning bores and adjusting sights with the methodical precision that characterized German military training. These weapons, manufactured by Krupp according to specifications dating back to 1918, represented 4 decades of artillery evolution and refinement. "Ammunition status?" Steinberg inquired. 47 rounds per gun, replied Weber, sufficient for sustained defensive fires plus emergency reserves for counter-battery missions. Our Fire Direction Center has calculated precise data for all registered targets, and our forward observers maintain direct communication with each battery. This ammunition supply, while modest by American standards, was carefully husbanded according to German tactical doctrine. Each round would be fired with calculated precision, engaging specific targets at optimal moments to achieve maximum tactical effect. German gunners took pride in achieving decisive results with minimal ammunition expenditure, a skill that had become essential as the war progressed and supplies became increasingly scarce. The 247th Division's defensive plan reflected this philosophy of efficiency and precision. When American forces began their anticipated attack, German artillery would engage priority targets with carefully calculated fires, disrupting enemy formations while conserving ammunition for sustained operations. German infantry, protected in their reinforced bunkers, would weather the American bombardment and emerge to engage advancing troops with interlocking fields of fire that had been precisely surveyed and registered. "Execute final readiness checks," Steinberg ordered. "American attack patterns suggest they'll commence preliminary bombardment within 2 hours. All units prepare for displacement plan Gustav on my command." While Oberst Steinberg conducted her final preparations, American artillery units scattered across a 20-kilometer front were implementing a fire coordination technique that German intelligence had dismissed as theoretically impossible. The 94th Infantry Division's artillery,
the 6th Armored Division's guns, and elements of 9 Corps artillery were preparing to execute a time-on-target mission that would demonstrate capabilities far beyond German understanding of American tactical doctrine. Captain Sarah Mitchell, directing fires from the American Forward Observation Post on Elm Ridge, was coordinating with fire direction centers that had spent the previous night calculating precise timing data for simultaneous impact. Unlike the registration fires and area bombardments that German intelligence expected, this mission required mathematical precision that exceeded anything in German artillery doctrine. The complexity involved was staggering. American 105mm howitzers, positioned 8.2 kilometers from target, required 73 seconds flight time for their shells to reach German positions. The 155mm guns of the 6th Armored Division, located 11.7 kilometers away, needed 89 seconds for their heavier shells to complete their ballistic trajectories. Most challenging of all, the massive 8-inch howitzers of 9 Corps artillery, firing from positions 15.3 kilometers behind the front lines, required 127 seconds for their shells to arc across the frozen landscape. American fire direction centers had calculated these timings with slide rule precision, accounting for meteorological conditions, barrel wear on individual guns, variations in propellant temperature, and even the Coriolis effect that influenced long-range trajectories. Each battery received firing commands specifying exact execution times. Fire mission, grid 347219, time on target, Battery A execute at 9:22:20, Battery B execute at 9:22:04, Battery C execute at 9:21:36. The mathematical precision required represented a fundamental evolution in artillery employment that German doctrine had never contemplated. While German batteries excelled at rapid, accurate fires against specific targets, the concept of synchronizing multiple batteries to achieve simultaneous impact had never been seriously studied by Wehrmacht artillery schools. German tactical manuals emphasized sequential fires, rolling barrages, and methodical target engagement, techniques that were tactically sound but predictable to experienced defenders. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, commanding the American Artillery Coordination Center, later described the technique. "We realize that conventional artillery gives defenders time to react. They hear the guns fire, count seconds, and take cover before shells impact. Time on target eliminates that reaction time by making every shell arrive simultaneously. No warning, no pattern, just instantaneous destruction across the entire target area."
British. The mathematical precision was breathtaking in its lethality. 105mm shells from 12 different American batteries, fired at precise intervals calculated by mechanical computers and specialized slide rules, all impacted within a 3-second window. The German defensive network that had taken 3 months to construct was obliterated in less time than it took Steinberg to draw a single breath. Hill 293, where Private Brown had been maintaining her observation post, simply ceased to exist. The reinforced concrete bunker, designed to withstand direct hits from 155mm shells, was vaporized by the coordinated impact of 6 105mm rounds that arrived within milliseconds of each other. The communications equipment, the observation periscope, and Private Brown herself were atomized in an instant of synchronized destruction. Battery Position Alpha, where Weber's carefully maintained howitzers had been concealed beneath camouflage nets, was transformed into a smoking crater by shells that struck with surgical precision. The gun crews, who had been conducting routine maintenance moments before, were killed before they could comprehend what was happening. 4 105mm howitzers that represented months of careful training and preparation were reduced to twisted metal and scattered components.
The secondary defensive line, the communications trenches, the ammunition storage bunkers, and the command posts that formed the backbone of German resistance, all were struck simultaneously by shells that had been fired from different positions at different times but arrived at exactly the same moment. The defensive network that Steinberg had constructed according to the finest principles of German military engineering was annihilated in 3 seconds of coordinated destruction. The silence that followed the barrage was more profound than the explosions themselves. Steinberg, thrown against the concrete wall of her bunker by concussive forces that exceeded anything in her combat experience, struggled to process what had occurred. Her carefully plotted defensive positions, the main line, the secondary positions, the artillery emplacements, even the reserve assembly areas 2 kilometers behind the front, had all been struck with impossible simultaneity. "Weber," she called, blood streaming from ruptured eardrums. "Hoffmann, report!" Neither officer responded. Major Hoffmann had been killed instantly when a 155mm shell penetrated the bunker's ventilation system with precision that defied comprehension. Hauptmann Weber had been vaporized along with her entire battery when coordinated fires obliterated battery position Alpha with mathematical accuracy. The radio equipment was destroyed, the telephone lines severed, the carefully maintained communication network that connected all defensive positions reduced to smoking ruins. Gefreiter Maria Schneider, one of only 3 survivors from the forward defensive line, would later describe the experience during her interrogation by American intelligence officers. "We had survived Kursk, Frau. We had endured the bombing of Dresden, lived through the retreat from France. But this was not warfare as any soldier could understand it. There was no warning, no sound of approaching shells, no time to take cover. One moment we were at our posts, the next moment everything was gone. Not destroyed by sequential impacts that we could have survived, but erased in an instant as if God Himself had reached down and swept our positions from existence." The psychological impact transcended mere shock. German soldiers who had maintained their fighting spirit through years of retreat and defeat, who had adapted to Allied air superiority and American material abundance, found themselves facing something outside military comprehension. This was not overwhelming firepower applied through conventional means. It was synchronized annihilation that struck without warning and provided no opportunity for the tactical responses that had sustained Wehrmacht resistance throughout the war. Obergefreiter Helga Fischer, commanding the remnants of 3rd Company after all her officers were killed, reported through a damaged field radio. "The Americans have developed some form of supernatural weapon. Our positions were not bombarded, they were simultaneously obliterated. Every bunker, every gun position, every communication trench struck at exactly the instant. This violates every principle of artillery employment that we learned at training school." Those few German soldiers who survived the time-on-target barrage provided testimony that would haunt Wehrmacht tactical thinking for the remainder of the war. Their accounts, recorded by divisional intelligence officers and forwarded to higher headquarters, described experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about artillery warfare and defensive tactics. Unteroffizier Ingrid Müller of the 2nd Battalion had been conducting ammunition resupply when the barrage struck. Her survival was purely accidental. She had taken shelter in a drainage culvert to avoid American reconnaissance aircraft, positioning her outside the target area when synchronized fires obliterated her unit's positions. "I watched through the culvert opening as our entire defensive line disappeared in a single flash, not hit by one shell, then another, but struck simultaneously by what must have been dozens of rounds. The explosions came from every direction at once, as if the Americans had somehow placed artillery pieces in the sky itself."
British Obergefreiter Anna Vogel, a radio operator who survived because she had been in the deepest portion of the command bunker when coordinated fires struck the structure above her, described the acoustic signature of time-on-target barrages. With conventional artillery, you hear the sound of guns firing in the distance, then the whistle of approaching shells, then sequential impacts. You have time to count, time to take cover, time to pray. But these American barrages produce no warning sounds, just silence, then instantaneous destruction, then silence again. Your mind cannot process artillery that arrives without warning. Perhaps most disturbing to German tactical analysts were reports from Feldwebel Christine Bauer, an experienced forward observer who had coordinated defensive fires throughout the retreat from Normandy. "I was trained to read artillery patterns, to identify battery positions by analyzing shell trajectories and impact sequences," she testified. But the American time-on-target barrages have no pattern to read. Every shell arrives from a different direction at the same instant. You cannot identify firing positions because there are no sequential impacts to analyze. You cannot predict the next target because there is no logical progression from one impact to another. It is artillery employment that defies every tactical principle we were taught. As German intelligence officers compiled survivor testimonies and analyzed the wreckage of Steinberg's defensive positions, the technical sophistication of American time-on-target capabilities became apparent. This was not simply improved artillery tactics or better equipment. It represented a fundamental revolution in fire coordination that German military institutions had failed to anticipate or counter. The evidence was written in the crater patterns themselves. American shells had struck German positions with precision that required detailed survey data, sophisticated mathematical calculations, and communication systems capable of coordinating fires across multiple divisions. Each impact crater showed evidence of multiple shell strikes within the same small area, indicating that American batteries had achieved accuracy standards that German doctrine considered impossible for rapid engagement techniques. Major Astrid Klemperer, the Corps Artillery Intelligence Officer tasked with analyzing the attack, reported findings that challenged every assumption about American capabilities. The enemy achieved simultaneous impact from batteries positioned across a 20-kilometer front, requiring coordination between at least 4 different artillery units. Flight time calculations show precision within 2-second windows, accuracy that demands survey techniques and computational capabilities beyond our current understanding of American methods. Most significantly, analysis of shell fragments and crater signatures revealed that American forces had employed different calibers of artillery, 105 mm, 155 mm, and 8-inch howitzers, in the same synchronized barrage. The technical complexity required to coordinate such diverse weapon systems exceeded anything in German tactical manuals. German artillery doctrine emphasized standardization within batteries to simplify fire control, but the Americans had somehow achieved perfect coordination between weapons with vastly different ballistic characteristics. They have solved problems that our artillery schools deemed theoretically impossible, Klemperer concluded. Synchronizing fires from different weapons requires mathematical precision and communication capabilities that represent advances in military technology we had not anticipated. This suggests systematic research and development efforts specifically designed to overcome traditional defensive tactics. The destruction of the 247th Infantry Division's defensive positions at Tannenberg Valley represented more than a tactical defeat. It demonstrated that American forces had achieved capabilities that rendered traditional German defensive doctrine obsolete. General der Artillerie von Seydlitz, the same officer who had pronounced Steinberg's positions impregnable, was forced to revise her assessment within hours of receiving initial battle reports. The enemy has achieved artillery coordination capabilities that negate our advantages in defensive preparation and tactical expertise, she signaled to Army Group headquarters. Traditional displacement techniques and alternate position procedures are ineffective against fires that provide no warning and strike all positions simultaneously. This acknowledgement from the Corps Artillery Commander represented a crisis of confidence that extended throughout the German chain of command. Officers who had built their careers on tactical sophistication and combat experience suddenly found themselves facing an enemy whose capabilities transcended conventional military understanding. The careful calculations, the precise timing, the tactical flexibility that had sustained Wehrmacht operations through 4 years of war were suddenly irrelevant against artillery that struck without pattern or warning.
British. As Oberst Steinberg surveyed the smoking ruins of her command, 3 companies destroyed, her artillery eliminated, her defensive network obliterated in 3 seconds of synchronized destruction, she confronted a terrible realization. This was not an isolated incident or experimental technique. American forces across the Western Front were demonstrating identical capabilities, employing time-on-target barrages that violated every principle of artillery warfare that German military schools had taught for generations. The survivors' reports flooding into divisional headquarters painted a consistent picture: simultaneous impacts, impossible coordination, devastating precision that left no time for tactical response. German positions from the North Sea to the Swiss border were being systematically destroyed by artillery techniques that Wehrmacht doctrine had never anticipated, and for which no effective countermeasures existed. Standing in the ruins of her observation bunker, surrounded by the wreckage of carefully prepared defenses and the bodies of soldiers who had trusted in German tactical superiority, Steinberg faced the dawning recognition that everything she had learned about warfare was obsolete. The Americans had not simply improved their artillery, they had transformed it into something unprecedented in military history. And this was only January 1945. The Americans would have 4 more months to perfect their techniques before the war's end, 4 months to demonstrate that mathematical precision and industrial coordination had triumphed over traditional military art. The age of predictable artillery warfare, where experienced defenders could read patterns and survive bombardments through tactical skill, was ending. The age of synchronized destruction, where survival depended purely on chance and positioning outside the target area, had begun. The proud Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe through superior tactics and combined arms coordination, was about to discover that their enemies had revolutionized warfare itself, transforming artillery from a weapon that announced its presence to one that struck without warning, without pattern, and without mercy. The mathematical precision of American time-on-target barrages would prove more devastating than any conventional bombardment, not because of increased firepower, but because they eliminated the tactical responses that had allowed German forces to survive overwhelming odds throughout the war. This was the beginning of the end, not just of German resistance, but of traditional artillery warfare itself. 3 weeks after the devastation at Tannenberg Valley, Wehrmacht High Command still refused to accept what their field commanders were reporting. In the marble halls of the Bendler Block in Berlin, General der Artillerie Charlotte Riedel, Inspector of Artillery for the entire German army, dismissed the mounting evidence with aristocratic disdain. Synchronized artillery fire from multiple batteries, she scoffed during a staff meeting on February 3, 1945. Impossible. The Americans lack the mathematical sophistication and tactical discipline required for such coordination. These reports are clearly exaggerated accounts from demoralized troops who cannot distinguish between rapid sequential impacts and true simultaneity. Riedel's dismissal reflected the institutional arrogance that had blinded German military leadership to American innovations throughout the war. Educated at the Prussian War Academy, where artillery was taught as a precise science requiring years of study, she could not conceive that American factory soldiers had achieved capabilities that German artillery schools considered theoretically impossible. Meanwhile, Oberst Steinberg, recovering from her wounds in a field hospital near Frankfurt, received visit after visit from intelligence officers demanding she recant her reports. Colonel Beatrice Neuber, from Army Group B's intelligence section, was particularly insistent. "You're claiming that American batteries achieved simultaneous impact from positions spread across 20 kilometers. The mathematical complexity alone would require computational capabilities that no field army possesses. Surely you mean rapid succession,
not true simultaneity. But Steinberg had seen the crater analysis, had interviewed the survivors, had experienced the impossible firsthand. Frau Oberst, I have commanded artillery for 8 years. I know the difference between sequential impacts and simultaneous destruction. The Americans struck every position in my sector at exactly 09:23:28 hours. Not 09:23:28 and 09:23:30 and 09:23:32, but 09:23:28, period. What German High Command refused to acknowledge, American artillery schools had been perfecting since 1942. At Fort Braxton, North Carolina, the U.S. Army Artillery Center had revolutionized fire coordination through systematic research that German institutions had never attempted. Colonel Margaret Thompson, who had developed the time-on-target technique, later explained the breakthrough. We realized that artillery effectiveness depended not on the total number of shells fired, but on eliminating the enemy's reaction time. Traditional bombardments telegraph their intentions. Troops hear guns firing, calculate flight times, and take cover. We developed mathematical models that allowed multiple batteries to coordinate their timing so every shell arrives before the enemy can react.
British. The computational requirements were staggering. American fire direction centers used mechanical calculators, specialized slide rules, and graphical firing tables to determine precise timing for each battery. Forward observers equipped with radio systems could coordinate fires from divisions across entire Army Corps, creating barrages of unprecedented complexity. Captain Jennifer Hayes of the 15th Artillery Battalion described the process. We'd receive target coordinates and compute individual firing times for each battery based on range, ammunition type, meteorological conditions, even barrel wear characteristics. Battery A might fire at 14:23:15, Battery B at 14:23:07, Battery C at 14:22:51, all calculated so their shells impact simultaneously at 14:24:00. By February 1945, time-on-target barrages were decimating German positions across the entire Western Front. The 156th Panzer Division, defending near Cologne, lost 3 battalions in a single coordinated strike that lasted exactly 4 seconds. The 89th Infantry Division, attempting to hold the Rhine approaches, reported that American artillery had achieved supernatural coordination that violated the laws of physics. Major Elisabetta Kruger, operations officer for Army Group Center, compiled increasingly desperate reports from field commanders who could no longer maintain effective resistance against synchronized fires. The enemy strikes without warning, without pattern, without any possibility of defensive countermeasures, she wrote. Our tactical doctrine, based on centuries of artillery evolution, has become obsolete overnight. German attempts to adapt proved futile. Traditional counter-battery techniques required identifying enemy gun positions through flash spotting and sound ranging, but time-on-target missions eliminated these signatures by firing from widely dispersed locations. German artillery could not coordinate similar responses because their communication systems lacked the precision timing capabilities that American forces had developed. Hauptmann Diana Richter of the 7th Artillery Regiment attempted to replicate American techniques with disastrous results. We tried to synchronize fires from 3 batteries, she reported. The mathematical calculations took 47 minutes, and even then, our shells arrived across an 8-second window. The Americans achieved 3-second synchronization with dozens of batteries. It's not merely superior, it's revolutionary. The psychological impact of time-on-target barrages extended far beyond their physical destruction. German soldiers who had maintained morale through years of retreat found themselves facing artillery that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of warfare itself. Dr. Maria Sommer, chief psychiatrist for the Second Army, documented cases of what she termed temporal shock syndrome, a specific form of combat stress affecting soldiers who had survived synchronized barrages. These men and women exhibit unique symptoms, she reported. They become obsessed with timing, checking their watches compulsively, flinching at any sound that might indicate coordinated action. They describe nightmares where time itself becomes a weapon.
Gefreiter Sandra Wolf of the 34th Infantry Division, who survived 3 time-on-target attacks, exemplified these psychological casualties. "You learn to fear silence more than noise," she wrote in her diary. With normal artillery, you hear the guns, count the seconds, know when to take cover. But American synchronized fires arrive from nowhere, giving no warning, following no pattern. You live in constant terror that the next moment of silence will end with your death. The Rhine crossing operations in March 1945 demonstrated the ultimate evolution of American time-on-target capabilities. Operation Eclipse, the coordinated assault across a 40-kilometer front, opened with synchronized barrages involving over 300 artillery pieces from 3 different armies. General Elizabeth von Mackensen, commanding the 19th Army defending the Rhine approaches, witnessed the opening bombardment from her command bunker near Speyer. At precisely 0530 hours, every German position along the river erupted simultaneously, not bombarded sequentially as military logic dictates, but obliterated in a single coordinated explosion that extended across the entire front. In 30 seconds, we lost contact with 12 battalions, 4 artillery regiments, and all forward observation posts. The mathematical precision achieved by American forces had reached unprecedented levels. Time-on-target missions now coordinated fires from corps artillery, divisional batteries, and even Navy guns firing from ships in the North Sea, all timing their shots to achieve simultaneous impact on German defensive positions. By April 1945, as German resistance collapsed across the Western Front, Wehrmacht veterans reflected on how completely American artillery innovation had transformed warfare. Colonel Astrid Hoffmann, former instructor at the artillery school at Munich, wrote in her final report, "We taught our officers that artillery was an art requiring individual skill, tactical intuition, and mathematical precision applied through personal expertise." The Americans transformed it into an industrial process where mathematical calculations and mechanical coordination produce effects that individual skill cannot match. The human cost was reflected in German casualty statistics. Artillery-related casualties on the Western Front increased by 340% after time-on-target techniques were introduced, not because American forces fired more shells, but because synchronized barrages eliminated the defensive measures that had allowed German troops to survive conventional bombardments.
British officers, as the war ended in May 1945, compiled analyses of American time-on-target capabilities for future military institutions. Their conclusions were sobering. The Wehrmacht, despite its tactical excellence and combat experience, had been completely outmaneuvered by an innovation that represented systematic thinking rather than technological breakthrough. Field Marshal Ruth von Stauffenberg, one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, wrote the definitive assessment. The Americans achieved through mathematical precision and organizational coordination what we attempted through individual excellence and tactical flexibility. Their time-on-target barrages didn't defeat us through superior firepower. They defeated us by eliminating our ability to respond tactically to artillery attack. The legacy of Germany's encounter with synchronized artillery fires would influence military doctrine for decades. The Wehrmacht's failure to anticipate, understand, or counter American innovations became a cautionary tale about institutional rigidity and the dangers of dismissing enemy capabilities. In the final analysis, German forces had been defeated not by superior technology, but by superior thinking. The American realization that coordination and timing could transform artillery from a sequential weapon into a simultaneous hammer that struck without warning and provided no opportunity for survival through skill or experience. The age of traditional artillery warfare, where defenders could read patterns and survive through tactical expertise, had ended forever in the forests and fields of Western Europe, replaced by an era where mathematical precision determined who lived and who died in the space between one heartbeat and the next.